Now for the fun part, we get to reassemble the upper. Now, when I'm assembling these, when I run my Remington 597, I do not like to put lubrication in it. However, if you do, those parts that were polished, the raised area on the race rails, or if you didn't polish them, the raised areas on the raceway, 1 drop of oil is enough to oil all 4 of those pieces. It's 1 drop of oil on a Q-tip or something, rub a little bit on there just so it has a shiny look on all 4 of those raised areas. Basically just a spot where you got metal rubbing on metal, which would be the metal from the guide rods, and where you have metal rubbing on metal, put just a tiny bit of oil on there, and that is all you need. Now, first thing to do for the reassembly is, of course, to put the bolt inside the upper receiver. Once you get it in there, it's going to stay in place by placing the basically would be the equivalent of the bolt handle in there. If you look on the top of the bolt, there's a little spring. Bolt handle goes in there with the curved end facing towards the front being where the firing pin and extractor are. All it does is slide underneath that underneath that spring, or correction, underneath this cutout on top of that spring, and it'll just snap in place. So that's just to give you a visual of what we're about to do. Bolt goes inside the receiver, obviously with the extractor and firing pin facing the direction the barrel is. There's a small cutout right here. The extractor goes into that cutout. Once you have that in there, again with the curved part facing towards the front of the rifle, just push that in and it'll snap in place. That'll help hold that in. Now, the fun part would be the guide rods and guide rod springs. This is probably the trickiest part of any reassembly. What I like to do to make sure that everything's going to stay in place is I like to put a guide rod all the way in, and I just use my finger to tip this back and forth to get that in place. Now what that does is that keeps the side that I'm not working on in alignment. Take the second guide rod, just set it in the back of the hole. The spring, tapered ends on the spring, one of them will fit into the bolt face, or correction, into the rear of the bolt. Into that little round area. Just slip that in there to get it started. Right there. Right into that little round, that little circle cut out where the guide rod goes. Put it in there to get it started. And then I push the rear of the guide rod in until it just, you can just see it inside the receiver. Take that into the spring and just put it on that part of the guide rod that's putting in there, just so that they're lined up. Now what I do is I just pinch the spring against the side of the receiver, and then I ease this forward a little bit at a time. While I'm doing that, I just push down on the back of the spring and kind of milk it. I push down and milk it onto the guide rod. Just give the guide rod a little bit at a time. I don't know if I'll be able to get this so you can see down in there, but if you can see down in there, just kind of milk it in place. Once it gets a little over halfway, you can basically stop and just push the guide rod, or push the guide rod spring down until it sets almost flush, and then you can push that guide rod spring, or correction, that guide rod, the rest of the way in. Now, since I had the other one without the spring in there, you see how easy that went in? Because it's already aligned. You just take a push pin or something to push it in there to make sure it's fully seated, and then it won't come out. Once that's fully seated, I just reach in with my thumb and pull the other one out. Just don't pull it all the way out. Leave it in there so it's sticking out just a little bit like you did the first one. Take your second spring, put the second spring inside that hole, put the other end of the spring, start it on your guide rod. Same thing, pinch it against the side of the receiver, and then just milk it on just a little bit until you get a little over halfway, and then you can put that spring almost all the way on. And that should get in. You'll probably need just a little bit of resistance, same thing you did the first time. Use your thumb to rock it a little bit to get the holes to line up, and that'll push all the way in. Make sure both of those are fully seated. Once you have those fully seated, now is the easy part. Some people use Loctite on these. I don't. The reason I don't is because the receiver of the stock, the receiver end of the stock actually comes all the way up to the top of the receiver. So the inside of the stock is going to cover those holes anyway. So these bolts will not back out. There's no way for them to back out. There's nowhere for them to back out to. Some people like to put Loctite on them. Sometimes I do. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to today. And just no need to. Put them in there and get them started. I like to turn them down until they just touch. Once they touch, they make contact with the bottom of that rod. That's as far as it needs to go. I actually back it off about 1/8 to 1/4 turn. And that's why I use the push rod to push the guide rods in, the pin punch rather, to push the guide rods in to make sure that those guide rods are fully seated so that I know once that stops turning, once it makes contact, it's fully seated. Back it off 1/4 to 1/8 of a turn, and you're done. By not tightening that down any tighter, you're avoiding putting torque on those guide rods, which puts microscopic flexion on the guide rods, which affects the speed of the bolt and the movement, freedom of movement on the bolt, which can cause jams and misfeeds. At that point, you're done assembling the upper. Now that the upper's done, the only thing there is left to do is to attach the lower to the upper. This really couldn't be any easier. If you look inside the receiver, right in the front of it, you'll see there's a small cutout right there. The lip on the front of the trigger housing goes into that cutout. So it'll almost just set right in place, but you'll have to maybe rock it forward just a little bit to get it into there. Once it's in there, just rock it into position. Make sure that your hole in the back is lined up. Probably just barely see in there. Once you've got that hole lined up, take your pin, push it in. You can usually push that in by hand. Make sure it's in all the way, flush on both sides, and there's your reassembly of the barrel and trigger housing. All you have to do now is put it on the stock. Figure out where I put my stock. For the stock, remember you've got two Allen keys, two Allen bolts rather. Allen bolts, you've got a long one and a short one. B for big, big goes in back, short one goes in front. You can put the small one in the wrong side, but you can't put the long one in the wrong side. If you tighten the long one down all the way and you screw it in as far as it goes and it's not flush inside the receiver, or the stock rather, you know you've got it on the wrong side. So, big one goes in the back, little one goes in the front. To reassemble this, I just set the stock down on something for this purpose. I'll actually set it in my gun rest. Just ease the trigger housing down inside the receiver cutout on the stock. Push it down all the way. Flip this over. Start the 2 bolts. And the big one in the back, short one in the front. Now there is a proper torque setting to put these on if you really want precision and ultimate target performance out of this. I would suggest tightening this down to the proper torque. However, if you don't have it pillar bedded, the torque ain't going to matter because you're putting it into a plastic stock, and the amount of torque that you have on there and the amount of flexion and give that you have on that plastic stock isn't going to matter. So what I do is I put it down there until it stops, and then just tighten my fist to give it just a little bit beyond a quarter of a turn. Tighten it down until it stops at finger tight, and then just tighten my fist to give it just a little bit beyond a quarter of a turn. And that's about all you need. Like I said, you can tighten that down further. You can actually tighten it down to specific specs, but you'll see that once that's in there like that, that's about all you're going to get out of it anyway, unless you really crank on it, in which case you're going to cause flexion in the plastic stock and cause yourself issues. And that is my completed worked over rifle for my daughter. All of the metal pieces are polished. Trigger and extractor have been replaced. All I have to do now is put the scope on it. It's good to go. Just do a quick function check to make sure that everything's going to function like it should. It's good to go.